You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. My guest today is Kurt Gray. He wrote a book called Outraged, Why We Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground. So I think it's going to be, a really good call. And we're not going to fight. We're going to find some common ground and learn about him in the book. So welcome, Kurt. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, tell me a bit about your background and what led you to write this book.
Yeah, good question. So, I've long been interested kind of academically in how we make sense of other people's minds. Right? Like there's this huge gap between my mind and your mind. Like, I don't know if you like smoked trout. I don't know, what you think about the Marvel movies. And I don't know kind of what you believe and why you might believe political beliefs that disagree with mine. And so there's a kind of deep academic question here. And then there's the more, personal question, which is that I've got family who votes and thinks, very differently than a lot of the people that I hang out with. And yet I know that both those sets of people are really good, caring people. And so how could people who are deeply moral, deeply compassionate, have such different moral views?
Really interesting. What was the research like for the book?
There was a lot of reading, obviously, but also, the book really weaves together the last 15 years of research in my lab and in the center that I run. And so it's really about kind of what's the basis of our moral judgments? Why do we get so angry? How does that connect with social media? And then how do we best bridge divides across lines of political difference?
So what are some of the interesting, curiosities or things you discovered in your research that just, shocked you or changed your mind about what you thought previously?
Well, there's really 3 myths that we cover in the book. And each of these myths, is really kind of like deep and ingrained either in society or in science. The first one was about human nature, like who we are. And that's really the idea that people think that we evolved as predators, as apex predators. And what that does is that means when we see the world and we see the behavior of our political opponents, especially, we perceive them as predators, as out for the kill, trying to burn the world down, motivated by malice. And those aren't helpful perceptions when we're divided. But it turns out that we didn't evolve as predators at all. And if you really dig into the anthropology, you'll see that, humankind evolved as prey ultimately. And that means that most of the time we're afraid. And when we vote for things and we, make decisions about politics, those are grounded in concerns about harm and protecting ourselves and our family. And so it's a really different perspective than seeing us as predators. Instead, we're prey.
Well, it's still, if we're, if we base our decisions, let's say, on fear, which I think is what you're saying, people play upon that. Oh, if you don't vote for this one, this terrible thing could happen. If you vote for that one, this terrible thing will happen. So is it any more helpful beyond understanding that?
Well, so it explains why fear is such a powerful motivator, right? If we're like powerful apex predators, you wouldn't think we'd be as swayed by, fear-based appeals as we are. So that's exactly right. But I think it is useful because you can better humanize the other side, especially after an election, right? You don't think, well, that side voted for this person because they want to destroy the country. Instead, you can think, well, they are really afraid, maybe because of the ads they saw in part, but they're really concerned about protection. And that means that when we come together in January, after the inauguration as a country, right, then you can kind of have the benefit of the doubt towards the other side.
Well, if you don't take, or if you acknowledge the fear and that's the basis maybe for voting, what happens when there's an absence of fear? Is that what you're talking about after inauguration, that the fear tamps down and now there's a different dynamic between, let's say, two opposing parties' constituents? Or, what does it look like? How do we move past the fear, or do we never move past it?
Well, it's a good question. In some ways, we never move past the fear because our minds are so grounded in these concerns about protection and harm, and our moral sense really revolves around where we perceive fear. But in another way, we can move past our maybe deep hostility that we often feel towards the other side, because if we recognize that they, like us, are trying to do their best to protect the country, it allows us to, maybe have a conversation with them. Maybe not think, wow, they're trying to destroy the country. Maybe instead think, well, they're trying to protect the country, but they make different assumptions about how the country works or who's most vulnerable to suffering. And so I think it's a way of understanding our moral divides, and understanding is the first step to bridging them.
Well, what if it's something else? They're not there to destroy the country, but they're not there to really do anything beyond satisfy their own wants and desires and greed and stuff like that. What if that's how both sides are? They don't really care about anybody. They're just there to, give their.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think it's important in these kind of conversations about politics to maybe separate our perceptions of like political elites and the everyday people who vote for political parties. And so I think there's no doubt that, there are people in the government and in the media especially who are trying to drive division and who are trying to get rich and, shake the country to benefit themselves. Amanda Ripley has a great term for some of these folks. They're called conflict entrepreneurs. So they're trying to get us angry. And again, as you say, some people are just trying to get rich, themselves. But then I think, what about the, 100 million, 150 million people, I should know this, who voted in the last election? Those folks are not just greedy, right? Those folks are trying to vote their conscience and vote who's the best for their family and what they see as the future of the country. So maybe separating those things, I don't know if that helps.
Oh, no, that helps big time, yeah. Yeah, I didn't mean to say that people that vote for a particular candidate are good or bad, but the candidates themselves. I somehow don't think that they really have everyone's best interest at heart. Forgive me, but this doesn't seem like.
No, you're totally right? And I think it's fair to say, the kind of people who really get drawn to politics, maybe some are drawn by public service, but, I don't know. They're certainly not the average person, right? But I think the average people, for the most part, are trying to protect themselves. That's a great point.
So what are the major things have you noticed in the book where you talk about?
Yeah, so I think the middle of the book, the second myth that we cover, that I cover with all the science, is really this idea that our mind isn't grounded in harm. And so this maybe connects a little bit more with the science, in the sense that there's other scientists out there that think, like, look, liberals, conservatives, they have really different minds. Maybe liberals are concerned about protecting themselves, but conservatives, they're concerned about more than that. They're concerned about things like religious purity or, listening to authorities. And this is the work of John Haidt, who kind of argues that liberals and conservatives have these fundamentally different moral values. And I think one problem with this idea is that it's kind of bad for our country if you think that, one side in this argument, the conservatives, are like somehow more moral than the other side. It's hard to have a kind of conversation about common ground. It's hard to come back together if some side says, well, we're more moral than the other side. I think the other problem is that this idea is wrong, and that if you actually talk to conservative folks who are passing judgments about, how it's important to listen to authority figures or, maintain religious purity, you will see that conservatives, just like liberals, just like everyone, grounds their moral judgments in concerns about harm. And so if you are an evangelical Christian and you think that, let's say, being gay kind of harms your immortal soul, I'm not saying I believe that, but I'm saying if you're someone who does, then it's not hard to see how they think that, you should try not to be gay, because if you're going to burn in a lake of fire for eternity, that's harmful. And so I think if you dig under these kind of conversations about values or rhetoric you might see online, you'll see that everyone in their minds grounds their moral judgments in harm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I'm just thinking about, again, the last, at least 3 elections. It just seems like you didn't even know what people believe. They just focus on the candidates, and it's like their entire identity is wrapped up in voting or not voting for that person, liking or hating the person.
Yeah, it's a great point. And certainly social identity has really expanded or contracted, depending how you think of it, into just being about, I'm red, you're blue, I support this person, I don't support this person. There's lots of explanations for those trends. We're segregated more in neighborhoods. There's been legislative changes that really, reinforce this us versus them. But I do think you're right that we've lost sight of why the other person might vote for these things. Because we focus so much on the candidate, we focus less on the kind of psychology and the reasons that someone might have to vote for this candidate. And, they could be wrong or right about which candidate is best for our country, of course. But I think if you dig down deeper, there's still the sense that like this candidate's going to protect us, is going to save the children and so forth. And so I think appreciating this can again kind of humanize people who vote differently.
What I wanted to say is I've heard families that say, I don't talk to my brother anymore. I don't talk to my mother anymore. I don't talk to my, families have been broken apart by, not by political beliefs, but just, what candidate they support. It's gotten so bad. I don't know if you've seen this, but in certain situations, it seems to be pretty terrible.
It is. And I think lots of families and friendships have been broken. I mean, especially when folks take their cues from social media. But I think there are folks who want to kind of come back together. There are folks who want to bridge those divides. And, we don't have to talk about politics as much as we do. And when we do talk about politics, I think there's a kind of a right and a wrong way to do it to build connection.
Well, what are some ways that people can talk about politics if they want to and not have it turn into, screaming match, or not have people like say, I'm not talking to you anymore? How do you stop people from getting outraged and crazy over this?
Yeah, good question. So this brings us to the third myth of the book, right? So the first myth is human nature. We're actually prey, not predators. The second one is that, everyone grounds their beliefs in harm. It's not the case that, some minds are different, liberals or conservatives. And the third myth is that facts are the best way to bridge divides, and they're not. So if you ask people, imagine you're having a conversation with politics. If you ask people, imagine you're having a conversation about politics with someone you disagree with, what should they talk about in that conversation to make you respect them? The majority of people say facts. I want facts. Don't editorialize. Just give me the facts, and then we can have common ground. And so, my team of researchers and I, we said, great, here are the facts. We gave the facts to people and they said, not those facts. Those are fake facts. And so it's this funny impasse because people want facts, but they don't believe the facts that the other side gives them. And it turns out that instead of facts, the best way to bridge divides is by sharing personal experiences, sharing stories. I mean, this is how we evolved too, right? You look back in time, we're sitting around a campfire, or even next time you go camping, you don't sit around the campfire throwing facts at each other. You tell stories. And that's kind of a good way to start political conversations, right? You're like, well, here's a story about where I'm coming from with my beliefs. And it's deeply personal, right? You're not saying like this candidate or this talking head said this. You say, well, here's where I'm coming from. Like this thing happened to me. And I believe we should have access to guns because once I used a gun to defend myself. Or I believe we shouldn't have access to guns because, my best friend was shot because of an unregistered handgun, right? So you see that now it's more personal. It's less about the candidate, as you say, and it's more about like where you're coming from personally. Does that resonate?
Yeah, no, I mean, unfortunately, I can just tell, well, I don't know how to put this. The people that are manufacturing outrage, I would say, I don't even know who they are, but it just seems to me that there definitely are people that are manufacturing this. They've got all the bases covered because they'll have stories. Whether it's, let's say, real or not, I don't know which one's a manufacturer, which one's a real. A story of this person and this and that happened to them, and that's why you should vote this way on this issue, Again, we don't even know. These are not our stories. Supposedly they are real stories. I don't know if they are or not. And then there's this misinformation, disinformation, BS. Oh, all of a sudden now it's a problem. I mean, who defines what misinformation is? So it seems like all these psychological things that you found, unfortunately, they appear to be known by people, I believe, that are manipulating everyone's affect and everyone's, relationships.
Yeah, fair. So knowing these things, right, people can weaponize them. Or, I mean, if you're kind of more generous, use them to kind of motivate their base if you assume that people are well-meaning and earnest. And so that's a bad thing. But I think in personal conversations, it can really show a new way forward for these conversations, right? So you're not throwing facts. And even in the kind of broader media landscape, when people are using facts to kind of, and stories especially, to kind of like nudge people, I think talking to someone you disagree with, right, you can acknowledge like, look, this story, I understand it's powerful. And even if that story is maybe not representative, the broader issue, right, it's cherry picked, it's not quite right, you can again still see where someone's coming from. And so there's still the broader problem, as you say, there's misinformation. But I think in trying to build connections and have more civil conversations with your friends and family, it's useful to think about this.
Maybe what's stated are ground rules. You're going to go into a conversation with somebody or someone wants to talk politics. Maybe say, look, I'm not going to use anything I've seen in the news. I ask you to do the same. Any stories I'm going to tell you are going to be my experiences, not ones I've just heard about in the news. And I ask you to do the same. We may find that neither of us really know much about this subject at all. And all we quote unquote know is what we've been told. Are you willing to go there with me? Maybe that would be a good preamble conversation to conversation.
Yeah. I mean, certainly when I teach my students in this class of science and moral understanding, we do set ground rules for how to have, more civil conversations. I mean, I really like the point though, like if you cut out what you've heard on the news and what you've heard from the candidates you're voting for, you might not know a lot. I think that's really true, right? Like, what do I know necessarily about tax policy, right? I don't really know. The economy is incredibly complicated. I maybe know that, there should be maybe less inequality than there is now. I don't know, maybe billionaires could give a little more money, but I don't really know about minimum wage rates, right? These are complicated issues that I have an opinion on, but you're right. I didn't do the original research myself. But I do think another ground rule you can think about is striving for understanding. And so a kind of mindset you can have when you go into these conversations is, I'm not going to try to win, right? Neither of us is going to try to win, maybe, as a ground rule. We're just going to understand where the other side's coming from. And then kind of changes it, right? It's not about pummeling them into submission and you being defensive for their sneaky moves. It's just I'm trying to see where you're coming from. You're trying to see where I'm coming from. And we'll just end it at that. Just understanding.
Yeah. I mean, statements like, I can't even believe you think that, they're so counterproductive. It's I've heard in conversations, people trying to shame the other person just for thinking something. How could that be productive? And how could that not create the most, hardened defensive wall when someone gets personally insulted because they believe something, or I can't believe you think that, how stupid could you be type thing. It seems like that comes up and that just completely obliterates any conversation that would go on.
Yeah, exactly. And, people often start conversations with those things. So I heard you voted for this person. It's you're coming to a fight. You're in the abstract, you're oh, I wish we could have a conversation. And then you show up to that conversation and you're basically exploded from the get-go. And so when you show up, right, I think you need to, and this in the book, I talk about kind of 3 things you can do. The framework is civ, the beginning of civil conversations. It's a little cutesy, but I think it's super useful. So first, C, you connect with someone. You don't talk about politics immediately. Say oh, how's your job doing? Oh, I heard you were, thinking of moving jobs. What'd you end up doing? And you can even ask deeper questions, right? I'm really sorry to hear about this thing. Were you sad? What are you hoping for the coming year? Right? These are questions that get at people's humanity, and they're not about politics. And then once you've actually had a conversation, you've connected, that's the C, you can invite someone to share their beliefs. As you say, it's not how I couldn't believe you did this. How do you do that? It's more hey, I understand you voted differently than I did in the last election. And I was wondering if I could invite you to kind of, tell me why and share your views, right? So you're not demanding, you're inviting. And then once someone shares their views, right, they're probably going to do it in a way that's a little offensive, because these things are hard to put into words. And then you're going to do the V, you're going to validate, right? You're going to say, you don't agree, but you just you just thank them, right? Thanks for sharing that. I understand it's probably hard to share and it's hard to put into words because it's complicated how you feel. And so if I hear right, this is what you mean, and you rephrase it, and then you can share your own beliefs, or you can even push back. Once someone knows you're trying to understand them, they'll be more open to having a dialogue instead of you trying to attack them. So CIV, I think, is a good framework to think about for starting these conversations.
Well, I don't know if you go out looking for a fight, but have you been able to use this? Have you had to use it? How has it worked for you? Or stories from readers, anything they told you that made you feel really good?
Yeah, I've used this before. I mean, I do have a story that I've had before. And so I took an Uber from my house to the airport. It's about a half an hour drive. And as I get in, the guy asked me what I do. And I told him I study morality and politics. And usually then everyone's like, all right, like, here's what I think.
Oh, I was just going to laugh because you said you study morality and politics. It's like an oxymoron. But anyway, go ahead.
And so he says, look, I got a special moral view. I got a, or what does he say? He says, I have a unique moral view. I'm a Christian nationalist, but not the typical kind. And so I say, I could be like, well, I don't know. That's weird. I don't like that. But instead, because I strive for moral understanding and I'm genuinely interested in people's different moral and political perspectives, I say, oh, interesting. I've never met someone who's like a atypical Christian nationalist. What does that mean? And so he tells me about, what he thinks about how politics should be, the structure of the family, the structure of the church, how all those things relate. And then as we're driving, up the ramp to the airport, we start talking about abortion just to have, a more contentious conversation. And he starts saying he's pro-life, and he starts comparing pro-choice people to Nazis. That pro-choice people, it's like the Gestapo or the people who run the concentration camps. And, because of these ground rules that I talk about, because of, this my commitment to civility, and also because I've really tried to understand him, I felt comfortable at this stage being like, hey, I understand you're really passionate about this issue, but you can't compare half the country to the Nazis and us still have a civil conversation. And he pauses and he says, I'm sorry. I'll take a step back. I was over the line. I'm just trying to put my thoughts into words, and it's hard. I think there's a slippery slope. I said, that's fair. That's a reasonable perspective. We can debate whether that's true, but you can't invoke the Nazis in a conversation about, well-meaning people having different opinions on a contentious issue. And so I think that's a really nice, demonstration that you can talk with someone who's really different and has different views on hot button issues, and not only kind of learn from each other, but also kind of push back a little bit and keep it civil. But the only way that works is if we both strive for understanding from the get-go.
How do you feel like this has helped you? Is it just are you living a happier life and having less arguments with people, or again, either your own experience or from what you heard from readers? How has this benefited them, this book?
I definitely hear from folks who use the techniques in the book and in the class that I teach. So many students have written to me in course evaluations or send me emails that say, thank you for helping me understand my roommate or my parents or my grandparents better. They feel a little more humility and a little less outrage. And I too feel less outraged, right? I mean, you can still feel convicted about politics. You can still feel strong about your beliefs. Like, that's human nature and you shouldn't give that up. But when someone does something or argues for something I disagree with, I find myself not spiraling into rage or being despondent. I can kind of understand where they're coming from, and we can have a reasonable conversation. And I think even pragmatically speaking, they can understand where I'm coming from too. And so, this kind of understanding is a two-way street, and we can build more civility, not just like I'm giving civility, but I'm building in others too. And I think we all benefit from that when we have a society that can have conversations.
Well, very good. Where do you want to take this in addition to the book? Would you create a class, let's say, to, that they could teach in schools on how people can work with other people that have different belief systems? That might be really useful. Or, where is this going now that you've done this book?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a question I think I need to think more about. The book comes out real soon, and I think I want to see what people really resonate with when they read it. And, is that going to be business leaders? Do they want to have these conversations in their companies? Is it schools, K through 12? Is it university administrators? I think any of those could be good, but I think overall, right, scaling these insights up, really talking to people who are trying to make changes in their places, their organizations, and figuring out how I can support that.
Well, hopefully critics will be outraged that it's so good, and that's what they'll rate it.
There's always got to be some outrage.
Yeah. Well, very good, Kurt. It's really cool that you've written this, and I think it'll be a great public service for those that read it and then engage with it. How can people keep tabs on what's next for you, and when is the book coming out, et cetera?
The book comes out January 14th. You can get it wherever books are sold. I also have a Substack, Moral Understanding Substack, it's called. You can just go to moralunderstandingnewsletter.com or Google me. And there we talk about kind of issues of the day, how science bears on them, and how people can feel less outrage in their daily lives.
Excellent. Well, Kurt, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.